My humble respect to Guru Mahan, Guru Piran Sangran, Guru Piran Nyo, fellow Jnanis. Today I'm going to continue with the discussion of monoism or Advaitha philosophy. And I gave you the definition of what Swamiji's, description of what monoism is. And I then spoke about some of the key essence of the Advaita philosophy and how that is, different from the school of thought of Advaita, which is dualism. And I also spoke about this one universal truth as part of the Advaita, and I spoke about the Paramahamsa, the qualities that, that is propitiated within the Advaita philosophy. And I gave this description of this swan, which is the Hamsa. Hamsa is a swan in Sanskrit, and the qualities of the swan. And an integral part of the swan's quality is that it is in the lake, it participates in the lake, but the water doesn't, touch or, don't get absorbed by the feathers. So our mind should be engaged in this material world, but not be impacted. And similarly, I spoke about the Paramahamsa qualities of dipping the beak in the water and taking only the nutritious, the nutrition that will, enrich and, give energy and strength and to the swan. Here, we need to dip our intelligence in the vast, expansive knowledge and take what is essential that will make our mind like the swan, feather, not absorb the materiality, engage in it, but not be impacted by it. And also in the vast, expansive knowledge that we have, some of it is wisdom knowledge, others are contemporary knowledge, and others are knowledge that make the mind shrunken. So we dip our intelligence into that vast, expansive knowledge to make our mind more expansive, more deeper, more universal. And this is what the I God philosophy is about. And this is what this discourse is about. How do we, nurture that mindset? So having said that, let's go back and review what we have done, and then we can progress a little bit more further on this school of thought, which is the Advaita school of thought. So if you see we spoke about in part of the Advaita, we spoke about God, nature, and the sentient beings. And often, most often, we often see this separately. I am different from, nature. Of course, I depend on nature. And similarly, God seemed to be an abstract idea. So for an ordinary human being, this seemed to be very distinctive, disjointed, and, mutually exclusive. That means they are very different. And Advaita comes back and says, through bhakti, if you have intense bhakti, bhakti will lead you to discipline. Discipline will then give you greater concentration, greater, ability to slowly, not be worried about this materiality. And in that process, you get the grace of God, which is here enlightenment, a little bit of enlightenment. And as you intensify, you know about God and nature and yourself better. You see that your intensity to be one with nature and one with God becomes more profound. And you have a sense of understanding of the relationship between God and nature and you, God and you. So that relationship becomes more and more clearer. And as we intensify that, we see that relationship then becomes much more stronger, more closer, ultimately leading you to this idea that the self is a subset of nature and nature is a subset of God. Though we may have this material identity or the nature has its own forces, all of that is a subset of that universal God formless, dimensionless, and so on. So while, Advaitha speaks about this, notion of getting the grace of God, as you get the grace of God, you become one with God, you become part and parcel within the kingdom of God, or the substratum of God. And you see that, your own identity becomes more porous nature. And you see that, while you have that identity, you are aware that self is part of God, manifestation of God, nature is a manifestation of God, and you get absorbed into that state of consciousness. And you see that slowly, the impact of material world dissipates. And this is what, in the Advaita philosophy of that relationship between bhakti and jnana and the grace of God, leads to this state of, enlightenment, where we are all part of this manifestation of God in the self form, in the nature form, and so on. So even with that identity, the whole idea of that identity identifies itself, being part and parcel of God, hence are able to comprehend, understand, assimilate this knowledge, and become one with God. So this is the ultimate state of, the Advaita, though, they say that we cannot be God, we get the grace of God. Ultimately, we become part of the kingdom of God. Okay, so again, we see that there will be a subtle difference between the Advaita and slide, and the Advaita. So this is the kind of continuum that we see. So here is the discussion. So Advaita says that, ordinary people see distinct, and through this process of bhakti and jnana, one attains the state of convergence. The Advaita is slightly different. Advaita starts off with oneness. We are all one. There is no separate identity. Whether you are self, nature, or God, you are all one. The only reason why we see separate is that because of these three important things. It says that avidya, which is actually absence of the proper knowledge. So people have the incorrect knowledge, misapprehension of the reality. So, and it'll tell why that happens. So avidya makes this oneness into separateness. So, and the second aspect is actually adhyasa, which is actually the superimposition. That's a projection of a substratum. While God is universal, the mind projects a smaller version or a subset version of God. So again, it is because of our, the mind has its own experiences and thoughts and builds structures in there, and it percolates. So this formless percolates into a mind that has got structures, and it gives that superimposition. I'll show you some examples of that. And the last aspect is maya. It talks about the powers of avarna. It, veils. It kind of covers you from seeing things. It is somewhat like if you have had a bath in a hot water in your bathroom. When you see the mirror has vapors, and you cannot see yourself. And I'm sure some of you all have experienced this. To be able to see yourself, you've got to take a towel and wipe the mirror, right? So Maya is somewhat like that, the power of veiling, covering, and the covering, it gives you distortion, you see, and that's, a common feature of the human mind. So what Advaita says is that we are all one. The only reason why we see separateness is because of avidya, adhyasa, and maya, right? So how do we overcome this? How do we go back to that oneness, right? So I'm going to give you some simple concepts, right? And we've covered this. If you see theory of light and color, you see that the white light, when it passes through the prism, the white light is, you can say colorless if you want to, in that way. So it's white light that is passing through a prism, and then it projects a spectrum, right? It projects a spectrum. So in original sense, it's a white light, but the moment it goes through the prism, it gives you colorful lights, right? So the question then is that our own is our own consciousness is colorless, formless, dimensionless. The moment it passes through our mind, it gives form and color and all those things, somewhat like the prism. But in essence, Advaita says that actually it's all formless and one. It's not separate. You don't see separate colors. You don't see red, yellow, green, blue. It's all one. But it's the prism that is actually refracting the light that is giving you all the colors, right? So it's somewhat like, as we said earlier, this notion of adhyasa is superimposing that, qualities within the prism that gives you the refracts light. So our mind, to some extent, is like a prism. So how do we then get back that colorful light back to that original state? And this is what happens. So we see that a white light that passes through prism, it gives you all the colorful light. And then you have that inverted prism that you put in, and it converts back that colorful light back to that white light. So if you see here, this is a very interesting metaphor. Think of the formless coming in contact with a material mind that is projecting all the colorful things. And you see that to be able to get back that, you've got to get to the inverse of that mind. The inverse of the mind, the inverse of the prism that will take you back to that original light. So what we see here is that the light that is projecting from the inner, that is passing through the mind, is projecting all the color. But to be able to get back to that colorless and formless, one needs to reverse that process. It's like somewhat like putting the prism or upside down. That reversing that process is called yoga, to be in union with. So it's not about observing things outside, but actually bringing things within ourselves. So the inverted prism is a reference to that going back, the kadavul, embark within ourselves, not outside, but within. So the reverse prism, for me, the metaphor is that it is the projection of the light needs to be passing through a mind that is becoming a state of samadhi or oneness, to be able to get to that original state. That samadhi state is the I God state. The samadhi state is that union state. The samadhi state is the yoga state, the yoga state. So we see that science and the laws of nature teaches us something about ourselves and our mind and our identity. So we see that what is that process? So the oneness, as what we are all that oneness. And because avidya and adhyasa and maya, we see separateness, we see multitudeness. So what it's Mahan and other Advaita teachers say is that, yes, we understand this separateness that we see in this material world, but to get back to that samadhi state, somewhat like this state, getting back to that white light state, one needs to have a process or a method to get you back there. And that process is actually the introspection. So you see, it's not outward, but introspect, somewhat like an inverted prism. It's contemplate not about the outside stuff, but it's a contemplation that is happening within. Reflection is also within, and meditation definitely is about, being within. So all this process of contemplation, introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation is part of the I God philosophy, but it's part of that within all the teachings, within all the scriptures is embedded, called vichara. So as long as we have that acharas, we see things separately. So you need to go through this process of, reversing that colorful light, unifying. So not shutting it off, it's actually unifying all the colorful things in our lives back to that samadhi state. Not getting rid of our desires by unifying, harmonizing all our desires, like how this prism harmonizes all this light back to its original samadhi state. So in that same way, this I God philosophy or Mahan's meditation or the Advaitic teaching is actually about bringing a harmonization between the material world and the spiritual realm. So we see that samadhi brings us back to that original state. So we see in Mahan's teaching and in Advaitic teaching, this notion of introspection, contemplation, reflection, meditation brings you back to that God, nature, and self are one. So as I mentioned, I really like this example of to show you that this inverted part is actually that whole process that all the scriptures talk about. That separateness is because of avidya, adhyasa, and maya. To reverse that process, because everything is coming from outside. So to be able to come back to the oneness, one needs to reverse that process. That process is called yoga, or the process of samadhi. So we see this, and what is it that we need to do? So what do we mean by the I God philosophy that Swami talks about? Or and this is what it is. It is very simple. You have that 7 P's. You've got to practice that introspection, contemplation, reflection, meditation every moment, every second. You've got to be thinking about it. So although, for most people this is hard, but at least allocate about an hour in the morning to do this. And the whole idea of introspecting, contemplating, reflecting, and meditating, because in that separateness, you see them separately. When you start introspecting on each one of them deeply, you start seeing the convergence that starts taking place. You understand life better. You understand your life better. And you see that the purpose starts becoming more and more clearer. What is the purpose of my life, right? And you see that meaning of life becomes better. The meaning of life is that I am not separate from God nor nature. Everything is part and parcel of me. As how nature is, my mind should be like nature. As how God is, my mind must be godly. So we see that our life starts transforming and changing, somewhat like the Paramahamsa, somewhat like the swan, which is, beautifully gliding in the water, but not touched by the water, beautifully dipping the beak and getting all the nutrition, but not impacted by, any of the contaminant. So we see that, this whole idea of this philosophy is about practicing this introspection, contemplation, reflection, and meditation, understanding the meaning of our own lives and how it relates to nature and God, and having that zest for life, having that, really enjoying learning, enriching, enlightening our own lives, consciously observing that Trinity, consciously observing the Trinity of yourself, nature, and God in everything that you see, observe, think. You start getting this passion. Wow, I have this divinity in me. And you see that a sense of calmness and serenity that dawns our mind. Our mind is no more like a rat always running around. This rat race stops, right? We start seeing, we become more calmer, cooler. We have time to contemplate. We have time to absorb in that state of both the self, nature, and God as one. And we cultivate perseverance, as I mentioned, persistent. And finally, you see that things become more and more clearer. Things become, all the complexity of all those things become more clearer, that you see, this is what it is. This is what Dvaita is. This is where it's going to take me. This is where Advaitha is. This is where it's going to take me. This is what science is telling me. It becomes crystal clear. And you may have had challenges understanding Mahan's teachings, but now it's very clear because your mind is able to essentially relieve from all this knots and say, hey, and build not only while the knots are being, unraveled, but also your bandwidth and the depth of that neural connectivity also increases. And you see that ultimately you understand things better. And this is what that Paranjoti means. That samadhi state, that from that multiplicity, the separateness, you come to this oneness. This is the Paranjoti state, the state of, Paramahamsa. So the practice is very simple. It is the unwinding from the materiality to the divinizing of the materiality, to be able to see that formless, dimensionless, oneness in both the material world and also in our spiritual realm. So we see this. This is a very important part of Swamiji's teachings. And just to summarize, so we see that Dvaitva starts off with the Trinity, God, nature, and the interconnectivity. And through bhakti and jnana, the grace of God, one attains this state, a state where the self, though the self has its own structure, the self is powered by this, Paramatma, or this universal formless God. The same thing with nature and God itself. So we see that while, the material identities are still there, due to the grace of God, the material identity becomes more and more porous, more and more lighter, more and more subtle. Ultimately, it converges to this God realization state. So this is at the bhakti level. And you see that most people in this state are really absorbed. They are very refined, the mind is very focused. On the other hand, Advaita is that this whole separateness is an illusion. As I mentioned, because of, avidya, maya, and, adhyasa. So he says that as how in Dvaitva, bhakti, jnana gives you that oneness, the convergence, in this, he says that actually we are all one, but, we see it separately because of these three things of, avidya, adhyasa, and maya. But we can get back to our original state through introspection, contemplation, reflection. And you see that the end game for both looks very similar. One is convergence to that universal identity, the formless, and the other one is be that. So there is a subtle line between these two. So you see that ultimately somebody who's, following the Advaitic tradition will come to this state, and there's a thin line between these two states, and ultimately you see that even that porousness disappears, they become one. And this is why it's not surprising that you see that great saints that have walked through the way from Advaitva eventually became Advaitha. You take, Mahan is a classic example, and you see in all the various scriptures that, in all the traditions, this process may be very different, but you see, ultimately, this bhakti, that jnana, ultimately, the intensive bhakti and the grace of God and jnana leads one to this vichara, which is the I-God philosophy. And you see that this vichara, immediately, when the jnana expands, automatically the mind will dive into that introspective, contemplative, reflective, and both the Dvaitvic and the Advaitic ultimately will reach the same pinnacle of that self-realization, God realization. So the only debate is that how one gets there. But for me, ultimately, I think I see that, when I put it all in this way, I see that ultimately, while, the starting point may be very different, the process ultimately leads to the convergence between the two. And clearly, I think, those who are in the bhakti path, when they true bhakti will take you also from the achara to the vichara. The moment you come to the vichara level, you see that the convergence within understanding the true reality becomes more and more clearer. So there is a subtle difference only, and ultimately I think it's negligible, even that many of the saints in the Dvaitvic end up having that similar understanding of that oneness of God, becoming one with God. So I just want to finish off with, this is what Mahan speaks about, this whole idea of introspection, contemplation, reflection, to, decouple one from the avidya, from the adhyasa, and also the maya, is to that unraveling process. This process where the prism is upward, in a upside down way. It is actually, it's reversing this process of this, what we call the samadhi process or the yoga process, to start within ourselves. and not from outside, but starting from within. And this is what Swamiji beautifully says, that by looking pointedly through the eye, both eyes, by stating it into one eye, right? That one eye is the inner eye, but wearing the crest eye and the essence of the embryo, the third eye, right? He says that I've attained the true self. So what he's saying is that by, oftentimes we see our physical eye, our material eye, by anchoring it to the inner eye and focusing there, and to introspect, contemplate, reflect on that state, you see that I've attained my true self. So what it means is that Advaitic philosophy of universal, the big I that Swamiji speaks about, which magnifies into our material mind and superimposes all these different beautiful varieties of things in life, can go back to the samadhi state through this process of Kundalini meditation, introspection, contemplation, reflection. And when one does that, one goes back to the samadhi state, the true state of existence. That's what Swamiji speaks about. So ultimately, one comes back to this Advaitic state of God, nature, and I are one. Sandosham.